so who else is behind in their reading goal? So now that we have reached the penultimate month of the year, I have become very aware of how behind I am on my own reading goal. I wanted to read 100 books. We're not currently on schedule for that, and typically I find that the easiest way to catch up on a reading goal before the end of the year is to read some short books. Plus, I also just adore short books. I love a short but punchy read because I really feel like a short book can have so much impact. At least that's what makes a good short book to me, and there are a ton of books I love that are actually under 100 pages. So although I've already read these books, I thought I could help all of you by sharing with you 20 of my favourite books under 100 pages. Whether you're trying to catch up on a reading goal or just want something compact to stuff in your pocket, or you're looking for even stocking stuffers for gifting, whatever you're looking for a short read for, these are all fantastic books regardless of their length. And to be honest, this list would be so much longer if I'd included books under 150 pages, so let me know if you want like a slight step up video in the future. But for now, we've got 20 books to talk about, so let's get on with it. So first up we have Hunchback by Sao Ichikawa, which is translated from Japanese by Polly Barton. This is probably best described as weird girl literary fiction, and it is about a woman who lives in Japan who was born with a severe congenital muscle disorder, and she is actually super wealthy. Her parents left her a ton of money, and she's used this money to establish basically like a care facility where she lives, and she also employs people to care for other people who live there. Because of this, she also doesn't really need to earn any money. She's independently wealthy, but she does earn a side income from writing stories and sort of journalistic pieces on sex, which she has never experienced. And in essence, what this book is about is how it feels to be somebody who has been desexualized their entire life. This is an adult woman, but who has never been able to or encouraged to explore her sexuality because of her disability, and she's exploring it through words until she makes a deal with one of the staff members at this care facility to actually experience sex for the first time. So this book is essentially about being desexualized when you yourself are a sexualized person, and kind of the way others treat you and perceive you compared to the way you perceive yourself, and finding ways to explore that. And it's very explicit, it's very punchy, it's very in your face, but it's very impactful and effective. I have to say a lot of these books are actually in translation, and the next one was actually translated from the ancient Greek. So this is Daphnis and Chloe by Longest, which was translated from the ancient Greek in this edition by Ronald McHale. Big fan of this translation. If you're looking for an easy one to pick up, it's the Oxford University Classics edition, and this is one of my favourite pieces of ancient literature. I harp on about this at any opportunity I get. If anyone ever asks me for ancient literature recommendations, this is my go-to because I think it's so fascinating on so many levels. It's one of only 5 ancient Greek novels to survive from antiquity. This was a genre that sort of rose up during the Hellenistic era and flourished during the Roman Empire, because prior to this, fiction was never written in prose, and these are all sort of essentially quite tropey romance novels, except they follow the tropes of the ancient Greek novel, not necessarily the tropes we're familiar with from the modern day romance novel. And I always think that's really interesting in and of itself, because sometimes I feel the way people talk about modern literature, it's as if we invented tropes 10 years ago, which is not in any way the case. And this is fascinating because not only is it an example of that genre, but it very much subverts those tropes, and it does really interesting things with them. So if you read it in the context of the other 5 novels, you get an interesting comparison. But if you also just read it by itself, it's a ton of fun. It's about a goat herd and a shepherdess who have been raised, not together, they have separate parents, but like they have been raised at the same time on this island. They've grown up next to each other their whole lives, and they've now reached an age where they're starting to feel attraction and sexual desire and interest in one another that they've never felt before, but they don't know how to explore it. So it's basically about them trying to figure out what you do when you fancy somebody for the first time, and it's hilarious, it's fun, it's easy to read, and I think it's a really fun insight into some of these slightly different genres of ancient literature that survive besides, you know, like philosophical texts and big epic poems. We then have a graphic novel. I've only included one graphic novel in this list because, let's be honest, graphic novels and comic books as a genre tend to be quicker reads anyway, so you probably don't need me to point that out to you, but I think this is a lovely little example of a graphic novel that falls under 100 pages, is a standalone, and I just absolutely adore. It of course is Princess Ever After by Kay O'Neill, and I guess I should show you some of the illustrations because that's a really important point of graphic novels. But this is a lovely comic or graphic novel because it's essentially for all ages. This could be read by a child in primary school and adored, and it can also be read by an adult in their 30s like me or older and also adored, because it's just so charming and the message kind of hits home no matter how old you are. It's about two princesses who kind of end up saving each other. So we have one princess in her tower locked away, who is waiting to be rescued effectively, but it is in fact another princess who rescues her rather than a prince. And there's a little sapphic love story, there's a couple of other characters in there, and it's about kind of like standing up for who you are and like standing in your truth and being who you are and exploring what you want from life, and it's just lovely. I absolutely love it. If you are into your classic fairy tales though, I would highly recommend Angela Carter's adaptation of the fairy tales of Charles Perrault. So Charles Perrault was a French fairy tale writer who you may know as the author of Cinderella, and this is Angela Carter's adaptations of those stories. They're pretty true to the original, she doesn't change a lot, but she also adds like a little bit of her own commentary to each story about like the morals and what you can take away and kind of like what the intention behind the original fairy tales were. So this is like a nice fun companion essentially to Charles Perrault's fairy tales, and they've obviously had a massive influence on the fairy tales we continue to consume today. Tons of these have been adapted into films. You probably know a lot of these fairy tales in one version or another, even if you haven't read Charles Perrault before. So I think this is a nice way to kind of like experience those stories, and also to maybe like dip your toe into reading original fairy tales if you haven't really done much of that before, because these are really fun and quite dark. I do actually have a few non-fiction books under 100 pages as well, which you would think would be kind of difficult to do much in less than 100 pages, but you could not be more wrong when it comes to non-fiction. I think you can get a really effective point across in under 100 pages. This is Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto. And nowadays I would say this would be one of my like first recommendations to anyone looking to read non-fiction on feminism, because I think it really perfectly encapsulates what modern feminism needs to be. Not to say that like feminism of the like 20th century wasn't also this has always been a thread of feminism, but this is my feminism. This is how I think we need to approach feminism, especially in a like 21st century when feminism has been somewhat co-opted by like the lean in movement and kind of capitalism and other ideologies that actually kind of leave everybody else by the wayside in order for like a very small percentage of women to gain a lot of wealth. Like, that's not feminism. This is feminism. This is socialist feminism. This is feminism that includes people of all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, all different economic situations, and how we include them, how everybody should be included, and how feminism as a whole can just make the world entirely better for everybody. And it's a really accessible short little read, so like why not give it a try. We then have a curious little book that I only just read. So I read this book very recently and it gave me a lot of food for thought, but it was also super zippy to read. Like, not only is it under 100 pages, the font is kind of huge, so you will zoom through this, and that is The Bridegroom Was a Dog by Yoko Tawada. And this book is essentially a kind of demonstration of how bizarre fairy tales and folk tales are if you truly situate them in a modern day realistic setting, which is really interesting. We have a slightly odd teacher to begin with, who one day has a man arrive on her doorstep and essentially just move in and become her lover and her partner, but he also behaves strangely like a dog. I can't say much more than that. And a lot of the story is actually told from perspectives other than the teacher herself, whether it be parents of children or the children that go to her classes or other people she meets with. And it also has like an air of how stories can devolve and evolve through like gossip and rumour, and kind of like what people are guessing about this relationship and these two characters and who they are, and how in that sense a fairy tale develops, which is very bizarre, but maybe at the core of that fairy tale is simply just a story about outsiders and people who are different. It is definitely strange, but it leaves you with a lot of food for thought. Now, you didn't think you were going to get away from this video without at least one more piece of ancient Greek literature, did you? Well, I've only included 2. I've been very kind. I've not turned this into ancient literature under 100 pages, but I do have one more to recommend, and that is Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days. So technically this is a bind-up of 2 poems by the archaic Greek poet Hesiod, which are more often than not bound up this way and read in tandem because they're very, like, comparative works, and this translation is by M.L. West. So in essence, both of these poems in their own way explore the kind of creation of the universe. So it goes all the way back to the very first gods, before there was any of the Olympians, how these primordial beings came forth out of the chasm, and then kind of the later generations of God were born, and then the gods created humans, and then how human life is structured, in particular in the Works and Days. So in some ways they kind of follow on from one another, like Works and Days spends more time on humans than the Theogony does, but you also see certain events covered in both of them, like the first woman, Pandora, and it's interesting to see how those versions are slightly different in each poem. And for anybody who's just looking to get into Greek mythology, this is a great starter. It's not the be-all and end-all of Greek mythology. These are simply Hesiod's version of these myths, but it gives you a really good foundation, especially for those creation myths and the origins of our universe and humanity. Although I will note that Hesiod hates women. It is just so clear throughout everything he writes that he hates women, so do with that what you will. We then have a tiny little book. Technically this is probably more of a short story than anything else, but you can buy it as one little book here, and that is Arthur Conan Doyle's Lot Number 249. Now, this is not a Sherlock Holmes story. That is right, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote fiction other than Sherlock Holmes. Surprise, surprise, although Sherlock Holmes is still my favourite. But this is a really fascinating little story because it's one of the earliest versions of a sort of mummy horror ghost story, in the sense of how we often think of modern mummies as these kind of reanimated corpses from ancient Egypt, who like walk around like this, covered in bandages, and like mess with humans. Like, this is one of the earliest versions of that specific trope and kind of the way in which that is depicted, and it's about a very, very, very arrogant student. I can't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge, but it's one of the Oxford universities, who decides to basically bring a mummy back to life, and how it causes absolute chaos around campus. And it's just a fascinating little tale by itself, but also if you situate it in the historical context of the development of this genre. And I just find something about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's prose so comforting, and that's probably just because I've been reading Sherlock Holmes for a really long time. And it's also part of this series that Penguin did a few years ago for their 60th birthday, I think it was their 60th anniversary. That can't be right, because now we're on their 80th anniversary. Maybe it was their 60th, maybe it was the 60th anniversary of Penguin Classics. I don't know, but it was for some sort of anniversary, and they launched a bunch of these, almost all of which I believe are under 100 pages, so they're also just like fun to check out as a series. And similarly, I have one from their modern classics range to recommend to you. So again, these are both great books, but you could just check out both these ranges. And this is James Baldwin's Dark Days. So this is actually a selection of James Baldwin's essays from the 20th century. If you don't know, James Baldwin was a civil rights activist and a writer in the 20th century, who wrote both fiction and non-fiction. One of his most famous stories probably being Giovanni's Room. A few of his books have also been adapted into films. If you ever get a chance to see If Beale Street Could Talk, watch it. It's such a fantastic film. And these essays are effectively about the civil rights movement and about race and racism in the 20th century in America, and they are like quite a damning examination of how people are treated if they're black in the US in that time, but also with sort of theories about what the future could look like, which is obviously very, very interesting. And I think they still have a lot of bearing and relevance today. We then have a short Mexican novella called Down the Rabbit Hole by Juan Pablo Villalobos, which was translated from the Spanish by Rosalind Harvey. And this is such an interesting one because for me anyway, because I read this back when I first started booktube. Over a decade ago is when I bought and read this book, but I still think about it quite often. So what makes this one interesting in particular is the narrative structure. It's told from the perspective of a child. I can't remember if it provides the exact age, but this child is less than 10 years old and therefore have a very warped perception of the world they live in because they don't truly understand what it is their father does. He is a drug baron and he's very wealthy, and because of this child lives in this like huge sort of house and has this very wealthy lifestyle, has anything he could possibly want, but he doesn't understand obviously where that wealth comes from or how his life is not the ordinary life. So it is kind of interesting seeing how or imagining how a child so young might kind of perceive all of that and kind of experience all of that when that's all they've ever known. And I think it adds to the shocking nature when you're seeing it from a child's perspective. Now I will confess, I'm vaguely cheating with this next book, but I don't care, I'm including it anyway because this edition comes in at 109 pages. But if you get rid of the introduction, which you shouldn't do, you should definitely read the introduction, the actual text comes in at under 100 pages, so it counts, right? It counts. And that is the Saga of the Volsungs, the legend of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the magic ring of power, translated here by Jessie L. Biot. So this is a medieval 13th century Old Norse poem which tells the mythological tales of the Volsung clan, but of course in doing so you're kind of just like getting a immersive experience, I think, of Norse mythology and Norse heroic legend, because so many recognisable names will come up. Even if you've never read any medieval Norse literature before, you probably know who Thor is, you probably know who Odin and Loki are, etc, etc. But have you actually read any of the source material? Well, this is obviously this is one of those main sources, one of the most famous pieces of Old Norse literature, and also one of the shortest. So like an excellent place to start. And I remember when I first started reading the Old Norse literature and mythology, I couldn't get over how funny it is. It's so interesting. I really love some of the ridiculous antics that people get into, but then there's also some interesting deeper meaning as with any mythology, and it's so fun, I think, to go back to those original sources when you've heard these names before, you've maybe heard a myth or two before, and to learn about them from a medieval or ancient source. On that topic actually, and I didn't really think about this, I have a couple of Norse books in here, except this one is a modern non-fiction book all about Loki. Specifically the Loki Variations, The Man, the Myth, the Mischief by Carl Johnson. Now this is one of the 404 Inklings, which are soon to just be the Inklings. If you're unaware, this short series of non-fiction books was published by 404 Inc, who have since closed their doors, and the series has been handed over to another independent publisher called Saraband. So they're going to keep publishing these, and they're going to publish more in this series, as well as like reprinting some of the older ones. But it's another series that I would just highly recommend, and I do have a couple more on my list to recommend to you because they do typically come under 100 pages, not all of them, some are a little over 100 pages, but all super short, so all super accessible, and they all kind of tackle really niche little subjects. And in this one we're looking at the way in which Loki has kind of appeared in different guises in modern pop culture, literature and television and film and retellings. So the book does a great job of introducing you to the Loki of mythology if you're meeting him for the first time and being introduced to him, but then it's more about kind of modern Loki and who Loki has become. And beyond just learning about Loki, what I find really interesting about this little book is it's basically a case study of how one mythological figure can grow and transform and morph and be reshaped by different people in different times, and I think that in itself is quite fascinating. So I love this little book, and I am going to be that person who includes a book I wrote in this video because I also wrote a 404 Inkling which is under 100 pages, and that is All the Violet Tiaras, Queering the Greek Myths by me, Jean Mingus. And this one specifically is about what like modern day, or starting in the 20th century but predominantly focusing in the 21st century, retellings and reimaginings and works inspired and literature inspired by Greek mythology that has been queered or deals with queer themes or LGBTQIA plus characters means to the modern day queer community. Like, why is that such a popular subgenre? What can be achieved through these queer retellings, and what does it mean to my community? And it was a really fun book to write because I got to do this big deep dive onto a subject I found fascinating, and I've had really, really kind responses to the book from other people who I think kind of felt similarly and had a similar curiosity to me about this subgenre, and I hope it's quite an empowering work. It's meant to be quite a positive book about the power of these stories and the power of these stories in modern day queer folks' hands. So yeah, there's that. And then I do want to mention one more, 404 Inkling. Like I said, quite a few of these would fit into this category, but I thought 3 was enough for one video. And this is Whatever Next, on adult adoptee identities, written by 3 authors, Josephine J, Adeline Barra and Hannah Fabian Smith. And it's all about these 3 women who were adopted from China into white families, either in the US, the UK or Australia, I believe, but specifically about how they all came together. They met, I believe, in Scotland, and how they started to discuss their experiences, the similarities, the differences, and the pros and cons of adoption. And I think this is a really important conversation to be having, because previously media around adoption has been so very much focused on the adopters and their desire for children, and I think we're seeing more and more explorations of the adoptees' experiences and kind of like what it means to be an adoptee, especially one who is maybe adopted over country lines. And it was a really fascinating read because I don't really know much about adoption or how that might impact your life, so I found this really fascinating. Then last of my physical books, and then I think I am on to the few that I didn't have physical copies of because I read them on my Kindle, and that is Mary Shelley's Transformation. Although this little edition actually has more than just transformation in it, but I still think it comes under 100 pages, which is kind of amazing. So okay, it comes at 101 pages, but it only starts on page 3, so it's fine. It's only 99 pages long. And it is Transformation and a few other stories by Mary Shelley. I think we as a society often forget that Mary Shelley actually wrote more than just Frankenstein, which is of course an incredible novel. I love Frankenstein, and I actually really enjoyed the recent Guillermo del Toro adaptation in the cinema when I went to see it, even though it changes some things. I think I'm going into film review mode, but I think it sort of captured the essence of the original. So I love that story, I get why we talk about it so much, but Mary Shelley did write more. So this might be a fun way to experience more Mary Shelley if you haven't in the past. The story of Transformation specifically is about a man who makes a deal with a strange, monstrous creature to swap bodies for an allotted amount of time, to experience life in the other person or the other creature's body, but the creature doesn't reappear at the allotted time, so he's unable to swap back. Okay, you'll have to allow me to refer to my notes for the last 5, because these are all books I read digitally rather than owning physically. And the first of those is Binti by Nedia Corrifor. So regardless of length, this is one of my favourite sci-fi stories of all time. It's the first in a sci-fi novella trilogy, but even in itself, just the first book achieves so much and delivers so much impact. It's about Binti, who is a human girl who has just been accepted to a sort of intergalactic university, but nobody from her community on her planet has ever left before, at least in recent memory. They are very much committed to their culture on their planet, and they don't believe you should sort of go beyond it, but she desperately wants to attend this university. So she decides to sneak away in the dead of night and get on a ship to go off to this university. And the whole series is kind of about kind of balancing change and tradition, and what parts of your culture and the way you've been raised you want to keep, while also being yourself and exploring yourself and what you exactly want. But it's also full of so many twists and turns. Like, I can't say anything because I don't want to give anything away, but you will not expect what happens in book 1. Like, so much happens in what is about 80 pages, and it's so captivating. We then have a short retelling of Greek mythology, and that is Hear the World Entire by Anwen Hayward. So this is a retelling of the myth of Medusa, and it's specifically told from the perspective of a Medusa post-transformation, in the version in which she is assaulted by Poseidon, then transformed by Athena, and she has now locked herself away in a cave and is visited by a young man named Perseus. And obviously I won't say anything about the storyline. I mean, you either know the myth or you don't. It's an interesting take on it, but in particular what this book does is take that myth and use it as an opportunity to explore trauma. The trauma of assault, the trauma of misogyny, and how that impacts your life and how you process that and how we witness Medusa process all of that. And it's so like gut-wrenching, it pulls at your heartstrings, and I think it's a great reminder that for all these are ancient stories, they still have a lot of modern relevance, and we can really draw out different themes depending on who we are and how we relate to them, and it's just fantastic. We then have a tiny little horror story which remains to be one of the creepiest things I've ever read. Like, very few horror books make me have nightmares. This one did, and that is The Beauty by Elijah Whitley. It's about a sort of post-apocalyptic dystopian world where women are no longer born. So like none of the recent births in memory have been women, and we now reside on an earth only inhabited by men, and a very few men at this stage as well. So they're living in like small communities, kind of waiting for humanity to die out because nobody else is being born, except that, you know, as these men are like waiting around, telling stories, kind of living their lives, they notice that the graves of the last generation of women have started to sprout strange mushrooms. And I can't tell you any more than that. The mushrooms are scary, it gave me nightmares, it's super creepy, it's very creative, and it's still one of the most disturbing books I've ever read to this day. Then the penultimate book on this list is a short historical romance called A Lady's Desire by Lily Maxton. Now technically this is like a short story novella situated within a wider historical romance series, but you can read it by itself. Like, I entered this series via this story, it stands alone, and it's about a young woman who's kind of decided that she's ready to become a spinster. She has no interest in marrying a man, and she has figured out what she's going to do with her life, which is, you know, live that spinster lifestyle, until she is reunited with her childhood friend who also married her cousin. So this childhood friend returns to her family home because the cousin has died and she's now a widow and she needs somewhere to go, so she moves in with our protagonist and her parents, and they are able to explore some feelings that they were never able to explore before. And it's just a very like heartwarming, soft, cozy little sapphic historical romance, which is lovely to read. You'll zoom through this one. Then last but certainly not least, we have The Tea Master and the Detective by Aliette de Bodard. Now Aliette de Bodard is a speculative fiction writer I absolutely adore, and quite a few of her books are quite short. Like, she has quite a few novellas anyway, so if they're not under 100 pages, she definitely has a few books that are close to 100 pages that you might still want to check out, but this one's a really like tiny little taster of her writing style that is incredibly creative, and it's somewhat of a take on Sherlock Holmes, which again endears me to it very much, but set in space, in which we meet a sentient ship who's now living in a body working as a tea master, who meets a detective and they decide to solve a crime in outer space. I don't know how else to sell this to you because it's so short that like I don't want to give away what happens, but Aliette de Bodard's writing style is just tremendous. Like, she's such a beautiful writer. She creates really interesting speculative worlds. She always explores such interesting themes and can do a lot with a few words. Plus, what a fun kind of take on Sherlock Holmes. So yeah, those are my 20 books under 100 pages. Hopefully there's at least one or two of those that you haven't read before that you can add to your end of year TBR to maybe bump up that reading goal. If not, just enjoy some short books. Maybe you just want to sit down with something you can devour in a couple of hours. Well, many of these would fulfill that. And of course, I would love to hear if you have any recommendations of short books, whether they're under 100 pages or even just like close to that, because I need to read some more before the year's out, and I also just love short books even if I don't read them this year. So yeah, until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!